See, we've got our first couple of people joining us here for our 3 o'clock live stream from Fort Humboldt State Historic Park. Thanks for tuning in, you guys. We're going to give just a couple of seconds to about a minute to let people trickle in here for this live stream. I'll give you some sweeping, beautiful views in the meantime. Our open field, the Bayshore Mall there in the background. Those of you guys joining in early, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what life was like at Fort Humboldt. Those of you guys who turned in earlier this week on Wednesday, we talked a little bit about the establishment and the early history of Fort Humboldt. If you missed that video, it is available on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube. Thanks for joining, you guys. And with that, I think we'll get started. Hello, my name is Kyle. I'm a Park Interpretive Specialist for California State Parks. As I mentioned earlier, we're out here at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park today. On Wednesday, earlier this week for our live stream, we talked a little bit about the establishment and the early history of Fort Humboldt. I'll review that a little bit and then move forward with what life was like at Fort Humboldt for many of the soldiers living here at that time. So Fort Humboldt was established with the job to mitigate conflict between the native people in this area and the soldiers coming in. Really quickly before we do start, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I just want to recognize that so many of you guys are at home right now, and to thank you so much for tuning in. I want to recognize that I am practicing our shelter-in-place guidelines here. Our parks are open and you can go on the trails, but it's important that you maintain social distance from anyone else who might be out here. I've washed my hands and sanitized my device before beginning this, and I will do that again before I finish. We are doing this to give you guys a little bit of a look into some of the parks that you might be missing while you're home, and to give you something new to look forward to come back to when you can come back into our parks and experience some of these places and maybe see some things in these parks that you didn't know were here before. For my little stream today, I just want to recognize too that I am on ancestral Wiyot land. I'm going to be using terms to refer to the Wiyot and the other native groups up here. I'll be using terms like Indigenous people, Native Americans, Native people, or first people to this land. I just want to recognize that there's no perfect term to refer to collective groups of native people, and that in most cases it's best to ask an individual what they prefer. So here we are out at Fort Humboldt today, on a nice cloudy day. Fort Humboldt was established in 1853 with the job to mitigate conflict between the native people living here and the settlers coming into the area for gold, timber, and some of the other resources up here on the remote north coast of California. I'm in Eureka, California, which if you take a look at the map, you go way up close to the Oregon border, there's a little dip, and we're right in this bay, Humboldt Bay, which is what kind of brought people settling to this area in the first place, looking to ship gold south down to San Francisco where they could actually do something with the gold that they were mining up here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what life was like at the fort for the soldiers living here, and some of the other people that called this place home. When Fort Humboldt was first established, there was nothing up here on this barren bluff. It's naturally devoid of trees, being an ancient uplifted ocean terrace. And when the soldiers came, there were towns that had been established, timber industry and gold mining that had all gotten started. But it was not the soldiers' job to join in any of these things happening. It was their job to establish Fort Humboldt up on this barren bluff. It was the middle of February, so it was freezing cold. And many of the soldiers, when they first arrived, slept right here out on the grounds that we're standing on today. Pretty quickly there developed a sort of class system here at Fort Humboldt, where there were members that considered themselves high society, and then there were the common soldiers who were not considered members of high society. One of the very first buildings built is this building right across from us. This is a surgeon's quarters. This is a reconstructed surgeon's quarters, but one of the first buildings that was built was a house for a surgeon and his wife. So while the soldiers and everyone here worked on that building, finally completed it, the surgeon and his wife had a nice cozy place to sleep, while all of the soldiers could only look on while they slept out in the field in tents. We're going to head on inside of this building right here, the hospital building. This is said to be the only structure still standing from original Fort Humboldt. Inside of here we have a model of what the tents were like that the soldiers were sleeping in back in those days. Let's try that again, see if it doesn't look like the server. Not a very tall tent. This is a pretty low tent. And so you could have up to 3 soldiers in those early days here at Fort Humboldt sleeping in that tent. Okay, it's not going to let us connect inside the building here. That's okay, we'll move on. So those dog tents, just like the one I was showing, they're very low to the ground, they're pretty small, and they could have up to 3 soldiers sleeping in a tiny tent, just like that, with nothing but a threadbare blanket between the 3 of them to share and try to stay warm. In February of 1853. Sorry, yes, I know the broadcast, we're having a little bit of connection issues inside of the building, so I head back on outside here where hopefully we'll stay a little bit better connected. So you had soldiers sleeping on the ground right outside here in the fields. Again, it was their job to mitigate conflict between the native people and the settlers coming into this area. And I did not mention how many soldiers were stationed at the fort. We have a diorama inside. When the fort was at capacity, it could station up to 90 soldiers here, and there were 14 buildings on site. Thanks for asking, Anne. So the soldiers were sleeping right here on the ground, and it was their job to mitigate conflict between the settlers and the native people. They thought this conflict was going to take them about 2 years to solve, and pretty quickly they got started on using the redwoods that were so rich in the area to build up some buildings so they wouldn't have to sleep on the ground forever. As I mentioned earlier, some of the first buildings built were for these members of high society, prestigious individuals. Surgeons, generals, all got buildings first. So while they would be working on these buildings for people to stay warm, the soldiers would still be sleeping right out here in the field. The building right across from us that was replicated from Harriet Simpson's letters, we'll go on in there in a minute and just check out some of our letters if our connection will hold up. We'll see. She would have these elaborate dinner parties. Harriet Simpson considered herself the only lady of Fort Humboldt. She was not the only woman living here, but she considered herself the only lady who was a member of high society. In her house, once it was built, she would host these elaborate dinner parties. They brought their maid, named Bridget, who was an immigrant from Ireland, to cook these elaborate meals for them, or at least as elaborate as they could get up here on the North Coast. They would invite all of these prestigious members from the fort to come and dine in their home. And instead of inviting all of these soldiers who were sleeping out in the field who built her house, they would not be allowed to enjoy those delicious foods. They would be forced to sleep out in the field, nothing to do but smell those delicious food smells wafting out of her home. Now again, the soldiers thought this conflict was only going to take 2 years for them to solve off the bat. But as they tried to figure out what they could do, they realized that these two parties had almost completely competing interests. The native people wanted to pretty much just be left alone, to keep living their life. And the settlers coming into the area just wanted to keep developing and pushing the native people off of their land. Again, I apologize about the connection. I know I just dropped off there a minute again. So they had kind of these two competing asks, and they were told to mitigate, not to take one or the other sides. So in most cases, the soldiers here felt like there wasn't a lot that they could do, and instead they spent their time focusing on building up the fort buildings here. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, at its capacity there was 14 buildings here and 90 soldiers stationed here. Those early days though at the fort before the buildings were built were so very rough, and many of the soldiers serving here were fresh immigrants to the United States, promised kind of this land of untapped opportunity on the North Coast. So needless to say, when they arrived in this freezing cold area with with nothing but a threadbare blanket between 3 guys in a tent, they were disappointed with what they got. So in those early days, there was a lot of soldiers who deserted their posts. It was said that at one point a general came out in the morning waiting for his troops, which again there could be up to 90 stationed here, and there was somewhere around 5 or 10 troops left hanging around the fort after so many had deserted in the night. Very commonly they'd go out to the nearby cities and sell off the pieces of their uniform or any other gear, weapons, and then go and try their luck at gold mining or logging or some other profession. I have a quote here from one of the soldiers' wives. Her name is Clara McGeorge Shields. I think she very well captures the sentiment that a lot of the soldiers had here at their early time in the fort. She says, "Life at the post was insufferably dull. The Indians gave little trouble, and months intervened between the arrival of the mails. There were days and days of rigid drilling and discipline until officers and men became stalled and weary. Commissary whiskey of the vilest kind was to be had in unlimited quantities, and all partook more or less. The combination of whiskey and idleness was followed by the usual results. So I've been talking a lot about Harriet's house right over here, the surgeon's quarters, a recreated building using letters that she wrote in her boredom. So again, there was not a lot to do because the soldiers felt that they couldn't really intervene with these conflicts with the Native Americans and the settlers. So instead, they spent their time here building up the fort infrastructure. And as I mentioned earlier, a building just like this was one of the very first built. Harriet Simpson was the wife of a surgeon serving here. To deal with her boredom, she wrote these extensive letters home. Her letters were later used to help recreate this house when the park was building back up some of these structures. So we're going to head inside here for a minute, see how our connection holds up, and if it does, I'll show you around and read you some of Harriet's letters. Again, these buildings are closed right now, but hopefully in the near future you'll be able to come visit these places for yourself. All right, holding up so far. So this is the first of the rooms. This is kind of like just a living room here, and we'll read Harriet's little letter right here. She says, "My dear Lizzie, would you not like to look into my little domicile this morning? You would see me seated in the rocking chair with portfolio on my lap, my feet on the rounds of one of the other chairs in the room. Johnny perched on it, writing a letter to Grandma about his new shoes, and diverting my attention not a little. A round pine table is on my right hand, with a little maroon-colored shawl for a cover. A trunk containing papers covered with an oilcloth and a pile of books in the corner comprises all of the furniture of the room. A pair of chintz curtains graces the two front windows, a little short gingham, sorry if I mispronounced that, on the west window, and the fire blazing on the hearth gives it an air of cheerfulness it would otherwise want. The melodeon that Pa sent me is the first musical instrument on the bay and is a great curiosity. Harriet St. John Simpson." And so now let's take a little look in this room. Again, as I mentioned, those letters were used to kind of recreate this room and even in some cases to decorate it. So you can see we have her little maroon shawl sitting right next to where she'd likely be writing her letter. This is a melodeon right here, similar to piano. This was one of the first instruments on Humboldt Bay, not this melodeon in particular, but this type of instrument was one of the very first. Harriet Simpson also found the weather here at Fort Humboldt so unbearable. It was very cold compared to what she was used to, that regardless of having a bedroom upstairs, she very commonly slept right here in front of the fireplace to stay warm. Let's head on over to our next room. So here we have essentially a home office for the surgeon, Josiah Simpson. So we'll read the little letter from Harriet here as well. This is from 1857. "Doctor sits here reading. You ask me if he is busy as ever, and I must answer just about. We were laughing a night or two ago and saying to ourselves that although he is going all the time, his receipts for the month were very trifling. Sometimes when I feel like grumbling at his being away so much, I console myself with the reflection that he is doing some good in his day and generation. The poorer his patient is and the less chance of remuneration, the more attentive I believe he is, and I would not have it otherwise. I like to see him take so much interest in his profession. Many officers in these out-of-the-way posts seem to find time to hang so heavy on their hands. Doctor says he's only afraid that we are making ourselves too comfortable." Harriet Simpson. So we'll take a little look inside of this building right here. Also, if you guys have any questions or want me to look any closer at anything while we're exploring, please just let me know in the chat. There is a little bit of delay, but I have no problem going back and getting another look at something. So here we are. We've got an old desk, filed away some pieces of paper, and some old instruments as well. An old bugle, a skin chair. One of my favorite things about this room that people don't normally get to see because it's tucked away right over here. There's an old bone saw right in the corner there. So while there was also a hospital here at Fort Humboldt, it may have been necessary for the doctor to take calls in his personal home. It also is noted in the letters that he was a doctor basically for the whole of Humboldt. He was the surgeon in the area, so he made house calls all the time to treat grizzly bear wounds and all kinds of other things. That he provided the service basically for the whole community of Humboldt, not just for the fort. And the last letter here, and certainly not the least, talks a little bit about the kitchen. And we'll head over to the other side so we can take a little exploration of this. The only surgeon in the area. So he kind of made house calls and the whole area, not just the fort. So this one's from 1855. Our kitchen is a little wing on the east side. It was put up after the rest of the house was built, and we find the want of a direct door into the kitchen but little inconvenience. There's a window opening into the hall just at the foot of the stairs, about a foot in a square and a half square, through which we pass dishes without stepping on the porch. We have bought a cow at $130, with milk 2 shillings a quart and butter 75 cents to $1 a pound. You will not perhaps wonder that we have gone through the of a cow, and Bridget understands the care of milk. We have churned twice, and I think by the third churning we shall make what I call good butter. Sorry about the bad connection. What is on the barrel? Barrel inside of the kitchen, barrel inside... Oh, on this barrel, we have just, using this as a table, we've got some playing cards, a small tin can, and perhaps some chewing tobacco. Were the beds made with ropes? That's a great question, Barbara. I actually don't know. These beds here are more modern. They're just used as kind of like set dressings. They're props. They're not all historical artifacts. I know that there was an early version of springs that was a little bit different, but I'm not sure about the beds here back in 1853, what they were made out of. I will do some research after the stream and get back to your question. So you'll see that I'm now exiting the building, and that is because in order to get into the kitchen, you have to go out the front door, out onto the porch, and all the way over here to head on in. It's like I was saying, this was onto the building later, so you'll notice that it's quite completely separate. As I mentioned, the Simpsons had a maid, so she and her child actually lived in this room. They didn't necessarily live on the other side with Harriet and her family. These were their quarters here in the kitchen. They would pass dishes and things like that through the window for the family to eat inside. So it wasn't exactly a lavish life for Harriet. She was an immigrant out of Ireland. She moved up here with the family. She was their servant, and this was her life in this tiny little side room. So I'm gonna head back on into the main house, take us upstairs just to see where the bedrooms are. They're not furnished anymore. Lost our connection there. Sorry about that. I see. I missed why you exited the building. So this kitchen on the side was an add-on. So this whole side part was built after the rest of the building. So they didn't actually build a door between the kitchen and the rest of the house, since Bridget, their servant, did most of the cooking and things like that. She lived in that building on the side, the kitchen, with her child. So I'm going to take you upstairs really quick, just to show you where the bedrooms are. Again, I did lock that. Again, those rooms are not furnished, but I just want to show you. We've got some good views up there from the rest of the fort as well. And then we'll wrap it up for today. Okay, back inside the room. Connection holds up here as well. I'm sorry, did I call the maid Harriet? Bridget, the servant. This is the stairs. Again, these buildings are but this is where their 2 bedrooms would be, one for the doctor and Harriet, and one for their children, which I believe they had a few children that they lived with. Also got a nice view here of the hospital building right across the way. So with that, I'm going to wrap up our live stream for today. I know we went a little bit long, but just talking about what life was like here at the fort. If you tune in again on... Alright, sorry about that. I know we're having connection issues again. Wrapping it up, if you tune in again on Wednesday, we'll talk about the start of the Civil War for Fort Humboldt. This is 1860. I just touched my face, gotta wash my hands. So 1860, the start of the war, and how that affected Fort Humboldt, as well as one of the members who stayed at Fort Humboldt for only 4 short months, but went on to become President of the United States shortly after. Guess in the comments if you think you know who that is. But again, I'm going to let us go for today. Thank you guys all so much for tuning in. We've got these live streams going at 3 p.m. every single day, so make sure to tune in tomorrow to hear from Griff in Humboldt Redwood State Park. Tune in again on Wednesday to hear a little bit more from Fort Humboldt State Historic Park, and again a little bit about how the Civil War affected this place, and someone incredibly famous who served here for a very short time. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to lock up these rooms, and hopefully we'll talk to you again very soon. Thank you.